here is for me to talk about where we are as an economy. In looking at this, I think one of the questions that I think is most relevant these days is whether or not we're headed into a recession. And I'm going to try to answer that question. Most economists shy away from it, and my predictions, I'll just tell you, never come true. So when I argue that we may be heading towards a recession, it's a glimmer of hope that I'm often wrong. But I want to sort of show you the evidence in terms of why I'm concerned. The first part is I want to take a look at how we feel. These are measures of how the consumer feels about the economy. And then look at real economic activity. I'm going to focus on what we call leading economic indicators. These are ones that turn before a recession. They either turn up or turn down. An example would be initial claims for unemployment insurance. They tend to rise before a recession hits. And then coincident economic indicators. These are ones that tend to turn with the economy. So if we're going into a recession, around that time, you may see a change in those particular variables. And I'll just sort of tell you my overall concerns. One is payroll employment. That I think is the weakness of all these different measures. The second is the dual mandate by the Fed. One of the things they're concerned about is full employment. And they need to have policies that will help improve the economy and its mandate to achieve a fully employed economy. At the same time, they need to control inflation. And the other thing I'll talk about, not listed here, but one of the data points I'll show you, is that inflation has been rising. So I think the Fed has sort of two opposite trends that they have to deal with, making their particular decision-making very difficult. So that's sort of the summary. And I think overall what I'm going to say is that because of payroll employment, that's the concern that I have with the economy may be contracting. All right, so let's look. Consumer confidence. If you can see the sort of 2020, 2021, and then the bump up in consumer confidence in 2022, since 22, it's been trending down. You can look at it month to month, but basically the consumer has been less confident about the economy. If you take a look at something we call the expectations index, which is in light blue, that threshold of 80 is often used by the folks that put these numbers together as one that is consistent with periods of time in which you've gone into a recession. Now, none of these say we are in a recession. The only time we have a declaration of a recession is from the National Bureau of Economic Research. They put out whether or not they declare the turning points in the economy. But the present situation, the expectations index of the future, has gone below 80 for several months now. Our own University of Michigan, the Consumer Sentiment Index, that has been falling since March of 2024. In some ways, it doesn't really matter on these indexes what the level is, it's the direction of change that's really the concern. So let's take a look at some real economic indicators. And I'm going to look at the leading ones, then the coincident, and then I'll have a few more that including inflation that I'll look at. So the leading economic index has been declining. It's been declining since 21-22. It has bump ups and downs, but it's basically been on a decline. The fact that it's going down, leading into a recession, so to speak, does not mean we're in a recession. If you were to take a look at the data going back to 2007, and I have some really nice shaded areas for the recessions, which aren't showing up on this chart. That kind of sometimes happens when you have a PowerPoint. But if you take a look at that 2005 to 2007 period before going into the Great Recession, the leading index was going down. So we could go down for quite a while, even before we declare a recession. So I was mentioning things that I'm not going to go through all the indexes of the leading indexes, but I'll look at the ones that are sort of troubling, if you will. This one is not troubling, actually. The initial claims for unemployment insurance have varied within a small range. Now, press release, these data actually include data through October. Even though the government's been shut down, if you go and you add up the initial claims from every state, fortunately we didn't have to do that. We were able to get the data from, it's called Horrigan Analytics. But you can actually report the data for October and all the way through November 1st. The one that's troubling me is the fact it's slight. It's slight. But from April 2025 to now, continuing claims have been rising slowly, suggesting that people have a harder time in the labor market, which to me is also evidence of the fact that we have these sort of narrative that firms aren't hiring and that people are staying put and not leaving. So the job market, it's dynamism from 2 years ago with labor shortages and the quit economy and all that, that's over. The other troubling one is housing. And this is going to actually show up in the inflation numbers that I'll show you in a minute. But building permits for new private housing units have declined significantly over the last year. I could have 5 or 6 slides on housing. They all show the same thing. And I know that there's a lot of debate going on in the last couple of days about affordability. I think the overall message that I interpret from the data is that affordability is a problem and availability is a problem for the housing market. A piece of good news, though, is that the difference between a 10-year bond and a 3-year bond, if you are less confident about the long run, you tend to go short, so that you would increase your purchases, if you will, of the short bonds. The negative difference that sometimes happens between a 10 and a 3-year yield, which is often coincident with a recession, that's actually has improved quite a bit the last few months. It did go negative in early 25, but it's actually gone back into positive territory. So let's look at the ones that are current with the economy. And the big one that I'm worried about, as I said, is payroll employment. Now, I'm not going to do a sort of a whole diatribe on the fact that the data are not manipulated and that the revisions are big. Overall, and you can actually, I was thinking about a community breakfast on that theme, but overall, these are reflecting the latest data after all the revisions, and there's been a real slowdown throughout 2025. The other thing that I'm going to point out is that payroll employment as a weight in the coincident index, because you weight each of the components, is over 50%. So that's contributing, I think, to the decline in the coincident index. We don't have data through October, so what I did here is I looked at ADP data. This is the ADP number that comes out the day before the employment situation. It's for private, so the private numbers are being shown for the total for the payroll. And basically, there was a negative in September of a negative 29. It did bounce back up in the latest report of 25. So that is actually sort of mitigating kind of my comment about the contraction. But I think overall, I'm still concerned about basically the slowdown. These are 12-month percent changes starting in February 2022, going all the way to the current, for which we have data. And you can see that the 12-month percent changes in payroll employment have been declining. They're still positive, but they're getting slower. The other indicator for the coincident index that I think is a little bit troubling, because consumption is 67, or approximately 2/3 of GDP. Real disposable personal income per capita has been declining in recent months, which I think puts a little bit of a strain in terms of what the consumer can spend or is willing to spend, and how much debt they're willing to take on. The other worrisome trend, I'm going to go back to employment again, is the fact that employment growth is no longer diverse across industries. We used to be growing like gangbusters almost everywhere, with always a couple of small industries, sort of like mining, et cetera, not doing quite as well. But we now have employment growth really focused, concentrated in healthcare and social assistance, and doing relatively poorly elsewhere. And so you can see healthcare and social assistance, this is basically August to August. And these are level changes in terms of thousands. You can see that those are the largest increases. And if you take a look at the ones in red that are negative, it includes non-durable and durable goods manufacturing. Now, I know that there's been a general long-term decline in the employment within manufacturing, but just in terms of recent economic activity, I find this troubling. All right, I talked about the dual mandate. A little bit about, obviously, a lot about employment. Let's talk about inflation. So, inflation has been going back up slowly. The 12-month percent change in the latest numbers, the government was, the Bureau of Labor Statistics was allowed to collect the data in September. It came out at 3% on a 12-month basis. In terms of the contribution, I mentioned that there was a connection to housing. What we basically did is we did a calculation of what are the percent point contributions of different elements within the CPI towards that 3%. And it turns out 41% of that change is due to the rent of shelter. So in the CPI, they don't look at housing sales, which is an asset price. What they do is they look at the rent of shelter. Either you're a renter, so what are you renting for? Or if you're a homeowner and you're renting out your home, that becomes the proxy for the payment for the services of a home. So it's a rental concept. And that concept is accounting for 41% of the recent change. In this case, we looked at September to September of the CPI of that 3% that I quoted on the slide before. The other thing I like to look at, and this is not one that you actually see usually in press releases or other areas, is there are 70 expenditure items in the CPI. I mean, they collect over 80,000 prices a month, but you can group them into different categories. And so if you have an expenditure item, say fruit, then that would be an expenditure item, and you have all across the entire domain about 70 of those. And so all I'm looking at is the percent of items that have an inflation rate greater than 2.5%. If you follow the Fed, they look at the PCE inflation index, and they use a 2% rule. A lot of people have argued that they should change that rule. The CPI tends to be about a half a point higher. So I'm just looking at the percent of items that are greater than 2.5% on a 12-month basis, hitting almost 92% in June of 22. It came all the way down to 31%, which is almost that sort of normal that we had before the pandemic recession. But now look at what's happened in the last several months. It's gone back up to over 40%. So I think the Fed has a dual mandate problem. Oh, I'm doing good at time. I saw the Zoom looking at a watch, I'm thinking, oh, maybe it's 8:45. I have a few more things to look at. One is real GDP. Real GDP, I think, is a little bit misleading in terms of the most recent data, and I'll explain why. So, real GDP, that 3.8 is basically real GDP growth. So it's adjusted for inflation. And it's, if you think of your, an annualized rate of a payment you make on your car, what they do is they take the quarterly change and they just express it in an annual rate. So all of these are annual rates, and 3.8% is pretty strong. But if you look at the components, these are, if you add those numbers up, you get up to 3.8. And what you see is a lot of advanced buying for imports. In other words, uncertainty about tariffs have led to a different kind of behavior. And so I think it's a little bit hard to tease out real economic activity here when it's dominated by what I would really call anticipatory or expectations behavior on the part of firms to get basically things on their supply chain into the country before tariffs hit even higher. All right, let's take a look at locally. So I was looking at the slides this morning and I'm thinking, I should change the colors because they're all one color. But all the yellow here means that it's been positive, okay? But what I'm really pointing out on the slide, if you take a look at Kalamazoo, 6.4 and 3.0. That is the percent change from the previous year for GDP growth in Kalamazoo County. So I don't know if you know this, but there's now county data on GDP, which is terrific. And that 6.4 and 3.0 is bigger than what we had in Michigan and the United States over those 2 years. So Kalamazoo was doing really well in the last couple of years. And in a similar way, Calhoun County as well. It's hard to interpret sometimes the data from Range and say, Joe, just because it's so small. But we do have, in terms of population, but we do have data from DEA on that. It tends to be more variable. Most recently, though, the numbers for both Calhoun and Kalamazoo have traded less in the state of Michigan and less in the United States. But still in the positive territory. For payroll employment, if you take a look at the dip from the pandemic, we have recovered in Kalamazoo by August 24, but it's really been slowly growing ever since in terms of payroll employment. And this is the Kalamazoo MSA, so it's Kalamazoo importers. Like the nation and like Michigan, the 12-month percent changes have been slowing down. And in terms of industry, there's actually more diversity going on in Kalamazoo than we have in the country as a whole, in terms of where we see pockets of growth. So we have government, mining, logging, and mainly construction. The sample sizes are not big enough to split those out. Healthcare and social assistance, so that's what you would expect. And then you have transportation utilities. So there's a number that are still growing in terms of employment. But again, durable and non-durable manufacturing have been falling. Healthcare and social assistance does stand out. You can see that the trend is slow, but it is definitely positive. All right, to round this out, I'm going to talk about whatever, I'm not sure what your favorite statistics are, but I'll try to hit at least one of them. I'm going to take a look at LFPRs, labor force participation rates, EPOC ratios, and unemployment rates. So for, in this case, I'm going to take a look at just pure employment. This is an employment number for the 4 counties for which we have Michigan Works, our service center. And you can see that Kalamazoo has not quite recovered from that blue. That blue is February 2020. Think of that as kind of a peak period before we went into the pandemic recession. Is that peak all the way from 2010. And we dipped down to 105 and we're back up to 131, so not quite. The EPOC ratios, and that's literally what it stands for, employment divided by civilian population, the civilian constant and above. It fell significantly during the pandemic, and Kalamazoo and St. Joe haven't quite recovered, but I just got to say, they're really close. And any of my statistician friends would probably yell at me right now for not having calculators standing there. So I'm just going to say they're really close. Okay. I've been away from the Bureau for 6 years, so I can say things like that. All right. LFPRs. This is basically the people who are in the labor force. They're either employed or they're looking for work, employed or unemployed. You divide that by the population, and they've recovered everywhere, which is the good news for the state. And then, oddly enough, I'm going to tell you that the unemployment rate, I love the unemployment rate. I was in charge of the program for many years. It's just kind of a boring statistic, in the sense that if it's the only thing you look at, you don't have a sense of what's really going on in the labor market. It is an important indicator, and I think the message here is that the unemployment rate rose dramatically during the pandemic recession, and it's come down, but it hasn't gone back down to the levels that we had in February 2020. So it's kind of a stubborn rate. There are a lot of people who are asking the question, is the natural rate of unemployment a little bit higher these days so that the expectation of going back down to February 2020 is a little bit unrealistic?